The Velvet Revolution was a revolution of non-violence between the Czech and the Slavic people in Czechoslovakia that occurred in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Present-day Czechs and Slavics tend to refer to the end of the communist rule in Czechoslovakia as November or the November events, rather than the Velvet Revolution, a phrase coined after the event. This phrase denotes the demise of a fierce, hardline communist regime that had repressed its citizens and atomized its society for decades, and that conceded power within days when confronted with persistent, yet entirely non-violent popular demonstrations. In February of 1948, the Communist Party came into power in Czechoslovakia through a coup d'etat backed by the Soviet Union. 20 years after the Communists came into power in January of 1968, the Communist leader Alexander Dubček launched liberalizing reforms which became the precursor to the Velvet Revolution. Only months after Dubček was announced head of the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia, Soviet-led troops invaded the country and put an end to the Prague Spring. In January of 1977, Václav Havel led the Charter 77 movement, calling on the government of Czechoslovakia to adhere to its commitments made to the international human rights agreements. Because of this movement, Havel received his first prison sentence. In November of 1989, just 20 years after the Prague Spring, demonstrations began. 3 days after the initial movement, the Civic Forum was established and it issued its demands for the government's resignation. Throughout the rest of the month, demonstrations were led by students, such as the demonstration of the 25th and 26th, which over 750,000 people attended. By the next day, 75% of the country's population participated in a 2-hour general strike. Finally, on the 28th of November, the Communist Party ceded its monopoly of political power in Czechoslovakia. In December of 1989, Communist President Gustav Husak resigned. And finally, in June of 1990, Havel was elected president in the first free election in the new Czech Republic. When looking at the long-term causes of the Velvet Revolution, the key events that contributed to the liberalization of Czechoslovakia was the Prague Spring. The Prague Spring was a brief period of liberalization in 1968 under Alexander Dubček in Czechoslovakia. Soon after he became first secretary of the Communist Party in January of 1968, Dubček granted the press greater freedom of expression. In April, he declared that he would have a revised constitution released that guaranteed civil rights and liberties and plans for the democratization of the government. However, less than 6 months later, the Czechs and Czechoslovakia were calling for more rapid progress towards real democracy. Although Dubček insisted that he could control the country's transformation in terms of keeping it communist, the Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact countries viewed the development of Czechoslovakia as counter-revolutionary. Dubček's thoughts and attempted actions would eventually lead to his first imprisonment. Soon after the Soviet Union's opinions of the matter were announced publicly, Soviet-led troops invaded Czechoslovakia and ended the Prague Spring. While the Prague Spring was short-lived, it allowed for citizens of Czechoslovakia to see what their communist government was keeping from them and what they as a society could achieve. However, the communist government wouldn't be overthrown officially for another 20 years. The immediate cause of the Velvet Revolution was the spark for regime change that came in November of 1989. Small, unsanctioned protests had occurred that year and earlier, but they had met the wrath of police. A march on the 17th of November in Prague, however, was sanctioned by the regime because it commemorated the 50th anniversary of the killing of Czech university student leaders by Nazi Germans. The iconographic of anti-fascism was encouraged, while expressions of universal human rights and political pluralism were banned. The march attracted more people than expected and included pro-democracy banners. The demonstration deviated from the officially approved route and headed towards central Prague, famous Wenceslas Square. Police intercepted some of the marchers and responded with characteristic brutality, while other demonstrators broke off in other directions to be met, again by riot police. News of the brutality nevertheless spread, even circulating on videotapes. Foreign correspondents reported the regime's behavior abroad. Czech citizens were outraged both by the police repression, which included numerous confirmed beatings of peaceful unarmed marchers, and by the regime's duplicity in denying it. Crowds arose in support of the initial protesters but marched in an orderly manner. The staff of the Prague theaters, in a country where the art mattered, expressed support for a strike. Theaters elsewhere followed. Charter 77 signatory students and others gathered in Prague's Magic Lantern Theater on the 19th of November and formed the Civic Forum, led by the dissident playwright Václav Havel. This wide-based opposition movement issued demands and called for the resignation of communist leaders. A similar movement, Public Against Violence, was formed the next day in Slovakia's capital, Bratislava. By the 20th of November, over 200,000 people were demonstrating in Prague, and in an ideological blow to the regime, many official trade unions and communist university students' organizations joined them, making available their centrally located facilities and coordinate demonstrations. On the 24th of November, Alexander Dubček, the leader of the Popular Reform movement in 1968 that was crushed by Warsaw Pact forces, arrived in Prague from Bratislava and was enthusiastically received by the crowds. During the same day, an extraordinary meeting of the Czechoslovak Communist Party Central Committee was called, at which senior leaders were dismissed. For the next 2 days, crowds of up to 750,000 protested in Prague's Letna Park, where compulsory and contrived pro-communist rallies had been routinely held. Havel thought that Prime Minister Ladislav Adamek was sympathetic to change and invite him to address the crowds. Adamek lost any support he might have had by using the unreformist communist-era language of restoring order. With the regime deemed still recalcitrant, the Civic Forum led a 2-hour general strike on the 27th of November, and brevity of this measure was inversely proportionate to its symbolism. It was deliberately short and brief to keep the regime from lambasting it as economically irresponsible. Instead, many worked an extra 2 hours to fend off such accusations and to sustain the economy and guarantee essential services. As much as half the population participated in making the strike undeniably successful. On the 20th of November, Adamek consented to negotiations with the Civic Forum led by Havel and proposed the formation of a new federal cabinet, which still proved to be communist-dominated. And revisions to the Constitution would end the communist monopoly on political and educational life. The Communist Parliament accepted them on the 20th of November. These changes, however, were insufficient, and demonstrations continued. After further but ultimately futile resistance by the regime, on the 10th of December, the Communist President Gustav Husak announced a new coalition government that included representatives of the Civic Forum and People Against. Gustav Husak announced a new coalition government that included representatives of the Civic Forum and Public Against Violence. Non-communists now formed the majority. Husak that resigned on television. The major events of the Velvet Revolution were the Spring of Prague and the November events, both of which were discussed earlier. When analyzing this revolution, the most noticeable components are the nonviolent tactics used by the revolutionists and method of nonviolent non-cooperation. These include communications with a wider audience, the arts and music, symbolic public acts, public assemblies, formal statements, and strikes. In the wake of Czechoslovakia's old communist regime, the need for economic reform was obvious, and people were prepared for the first step, raise in pricing. While people were aware of prices would go up, for most people it came as a shock when the price of food began to rise. For example, the cost of bread went up 100%, and dairy products by half that. Pensioners, not well off to begin with, were left with little money, then a promise of an 8% raise down the road. Because of the incline of food prices, food consumption dropped by 10% in 1990, but food prices weren't the only conflict within the new nation. There were problems with healthcare pricing and with ownership of land, which had been taken from them by the Communist Party. Although all these problems weighed heavily on the people, memories of the regime they hated and hope for the better future gave them the strength to go on. While there were few consequences that came from the revolution that were long-term, two of the biggest events to happen in response to the Velvet Revolution was the splitting of Czechoslovakia into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and the new Czech Republic joining both the UN and NATO. The Czech Republic and Slovakia had existed separately since January 1st, 1993. Integration with the European community and Europe security structures became an objective of both states. Mutual relationships were kept above standard due to a mixture of citizens after almost 90 years of coexistence in one state. In the years after the split government, both countries remained stable with support from each other. In 1999, the Czech Republic joined the United Nations and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.